The door of the Northgate Group home clicked shut behind Silas Thornquist, with a sound he knew better than his own name. Clean, metallic. The sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. For 2 years, that sound had meant he was in for the night. Safe, if you wanted to call it that. Trapped, if you were being honest with yourself. Today, it meant he was out for good. His 18th birthday was 3 weeks away. But the state had run out of patience, and so had Mrs. Pruitt. She stood on the other side of the glass panel door, her arms crossed her expression. A careful mixture of professional pity and personal relief. He was no longer her problem. He was no longer anyone's problem. He was just a boy on a sidewalk in Denver holding a single cardboard box, watching his breath turn white in the November air. The box was a pathetic archive of 17 years. A few worn paperbacks with broken spines. A change of clothes folded too neatly. A faded photograph of a woman he barely remembered wearing a yellow summer dress, standing in front of a pickup truck, with a man whose face was kind and weathered and utterly strange to him. And underneath all of it, an official-looking manila envelope that felt heavier than everything else combined. That envelope was the reason he was standing here blinking into the weak sun, instead of being shipped to a transitional housing shelter downtown, like every other kid who aged out before they were ready. It was his inheritance, or as the social worker had called it in her clipped voice, his familial asset. He had never thought he had any of those. His file had said orphan in big block letters at the top, and that word had always felt both too dramatic and too simple for the truth. The truth was he was just alone. The wind cut through his thin jacket, and he shifted the box. The corner of the envelope dug into his ribs like a finger trying to get his attention. Inside was a deed. A single iron key, pitted and old. And a letter from a lawyer he had spoken to exactly once on the phone. The lawyer's voice had been dry as the dust under a forgotten bed. Drier, maybe. He had explained in flat, careful words that Silas's grandfather, a man named Ezra Thornquist, had passed away 3 months ago. He had left his sole grandson the only thing he owned in this world. 5.2 acres of undeveloped land in Telluride County, high in the Colorado Rockies. There were complications, the lawyer had said. Significant tax arrears. A standing offer from a development corporation. Frankly, son, the offer is your best bet. It will clear the debt and leave you with a little starting capital. He had made it sound so simple. Take the money. Start over. Forget the rocks and the trees you never knew you owned. Forget the man in the photograph. Mrs. Pruitt had agreed in that brisk way she agreed with anything that meant less paperwork. It is a blessing, Silas, she had said, not looking up from her files. A clean break, but the iron key in the envelope had felt heavy in his palm when he shook it out into his hand. It was old. Pitted with rust. It had a weight to it that no modern key ever had. It did not feel like a key to a clean break. It felt like a key to something complicated, something old, something that had been waiting a long time to be opened and did not want to be forgotten. So he had said no. He had told the lawyer, a Mr. Marcus Whitfield, that he wanted to see it first. Whitfield had sighed a long, weary sound that traveled all the way through the phone line and seemed to come from a different century. The state considers you provisionally emancipated for the purposes of this inheritance, he had said. The choice is yours. But I am advising you as your counsel that this is a mistake. There is nothing out there for you, Silas. Maybe he was right. Standing on that sidewalk now with the group home finally and forever at his back, the weight of nothing felt enormous. It pressed in on all sides like cold water. There was no one to tell him when to wake up, no one to tell him when to eat, no one to read his mail or check his pockets or wake him up at 6 a.m. for chores. The freedom of it terrified him. It sat in his stomach like a stone, but underneath the fear he felt something else. A small, stubborn flicker. Something he had not felt in a long, long time. Curiosity, maybe. Or something close to hope. He looked down at the box, at the photograph on top. His mother smiling her arm around the weathered man. They were standing in front of an old Ford pickup trees, blurring in the background. The only picture he had of his grandfather. The only picture he had ever had. He took a breath. The cold air stung his lungs. Whitfield was wrong. There was something out there. There were 5 acres of something sitting in the mountains with his name on the deed. And for the first time in 17 years, he had a direction to walk in. It was not a home, not yet. But it was a way. And right then, a way was enough. The next morning, Silas sat in a chair on the 32nd floor of a glass tower that scraped the Denver sky, holding his cardboard box in his lap, because there was nowhere else to put it. The lobby downstairs had been all polished marble and silent elevators, the kind of place that made him feel grubby just for breathing in it. Up here, it was worse. The air was too still. The carpet too thick. The man behind the desk was made of straight lines and sharp angles from his perfectly parted gray hair to the crease in his trousers. He had not shaken Silas's hand. He had only gestured to the chair. Marcus Whitfield was not unkind. He was simply efficient. The way a surgeon was efficient, the way a clock was efficient. "Let us be clear, Silas," he said. His voice in person was the same as on the phone. Dry, flat. I was your grandfather's attorney for a single transaction 20 years ago. My inclusion in his will was a formality. My obligation is to inform you of your inheritance and its encumbrances. My advice is personal, not professional. He slid the envelope across the vast expanse of his polished desk. This is the deed to a parcel of land in Telluride County. 5.2 acres. It is for all intents and purposes worthless. Worthless. The word hung in the cool, conditioned air. Silas thought about the box in his lap. Everything he owned in the world was, by that definition, worthless. My grandfather, he started. His voice came out rough. Did he live there? Whitfield gave a short, humorless sound that might have been a laugh. Live there? No. No one could live there. He purchased it as a passion project, you might say. He believed the land had some unique mineralogical significance. He was, in my professional opinion, mistaken. He opened a drawer. He pulled out another file, this one thicker, and laid it on the desk between them. The logo on the letterhead was a stylized mountain range. Underneath the mountain were the words, Pioneer Development. Pioneer has been trying to acquire that parcel for over a decade, Whitfield said. Your grandfather refused every offer. Now that he has passed, they have renewed their offer to his estate, which is to say to you. They are offering $30,000. $30,000. The number was so abstract it might as well have been $1 million. It was more money than Silas had ever held in his hands at one time. It was more money than he had ever imagined holding. That sounds like a lot, he said quietly. It is not, Whitfield said. His tone sharpened. It is a nuisance fee. They want the parcel to complete their portfolio for a future resort project. But here's the complication. He tapped a different sheet. Your grandfather did not pay property taxes for the last 6 years. The total arrears with penalties and interest comes to $28,477. The county has a lien on the property. If the taxes are not paid within 90 days, the land will be seized and sold at public auction. He let that sit. The silence in the office was thick. Outside, far below, a faint siren wailed and faded. So, Pioneer's offer. Silas said, slowly working it out, pays the taxes. And leaves me with what? $1,623 to be exact, Whitfield said, without a hint of irony. It is not a fortune, but it is a start. A deposit on an apartment, a bus ticket somewhere warmer. It is a way out, Silas. He saw Silas the way a man sees a leaky faucet, as a problem to be patched. The delinquent grandson of his eccentric dead client. He was offering a clean slate, a handful of cash, and a final eraser to pass over the man in the photograph. Silas looked down at his hands. They were calloused from his work-study job washing dishes at Northgate. He thought about the iron key in the envelope, the weight of it. What is on the land, he asked. Right now. Is there a building? A shed? Whitfield frowned, annoyed by the deviation from his script. He consulted his notes. The survey from 5 years ago indicates a non-permanent structure. A Quonset hut, I believe. And a cave. The property is essentially a rock face with a bit of forest. The hut is listed as being in a state of disrepair. A hut and a cave. The image formed in Silas's mind strange and compelling. A metal shell leaning against a hole in the earth, a door, a key. A man he had never known who had owned both. I want to go, he said. The words came out firmer than he expected. I want to see it. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He looked at Silas for a long moment, recalculating. He had assumed Silas was desperate, and Silas was. But the lawyer had mistaken desperation for the absence of will. The bus ticket to Silver Creek will cost you $74, Whitfield said, his voice clipped. From there, it is an 8-mile walk along an unmaintained road. There is no address. You will need a topographical map. I have enclosed one. Once you arrive, I have no idea how you plan to survive. But the choice, as I said, is yours. The offer from Pioneer stands for 90 days. My advice is to come to your senses long before then. He stood. The meeting was over. Silas stood too. He picked up his box. He felt the weight of the envelope inside it. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield, he said. Whitfield did not answer. He only watched as Silas walked out a problem, leaving his office on its way to becoming someone else's. Or no one's at all. The Greyhound bus groaned out of Denver's concrete heart at 6 a.m, leaving the tall buildings behind like a discarded skyline. Silas sat by a grimy window, his box on the seat beside him, and watched the world he knew dissolve into a smear of suburbs. Then strip malls, then fields gone brown with November. For the first hour, his mind was a frantic buzzing. Liability, tax arrears, nuisance fee. Each of the lawyer's phrases was a brick in a wall of impossibility. He had $63 left in his pocket after the ticket. He had a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a cheap sleeping bag, and a flashlight he had bought at a drugstore. That was the entirety of his net worth. Every instinct screamed at him to get off at the next stop, find a phone call Whitfield, backtake the $1,600 and run. But then he would look down at the topographical map spread across his lap. It was a beautiful thing. All swirling contour lines in delicate shades of brown and green. A blue line marked a creek. A dense green patch was labeled National Forest. And in the middle of it all, a small hand-drawn red square neatly labeled in tiny, precise handwriting. Parcel 734-B. B, his land. His grandfather had drawn that square. The handwriting was small and exact. The kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who measured things for a living. He had made other marks too. Tiny cryptic symbols next to certain elevations. a faint arrow pointing toward the northern edge of the property, a series of small dots along the blue creek line. It was a language Silas did not understand. But it was a message. It felt like a conversation across time and across death with a man he had only met once when he was 5 years old, in a memory so faded it might as well have been a dream. He shifted the box on the seat. He reached inside past the jar of peanut butter and dug out a paperback he had not opened in years. It had been his mother's, one of the few things from her life that had followed him into the system. A worn copy of an old Western novel, the cover faded to the color of dried wheat. He opened it without thinking, just to touch something of hers. And that was when something fell out from between the pages. A photograph. It landed in his lap face down, and for a long moment he just stared at it. He had been carrying that book for 10 years. He had read it twice, and he had never seen this picture before. It must have been tucked deep near the spine, hidden under the jacket flap. He turned it over. It was a small color print faded with time. His mother, Sarah, was younger than he had ever seen her. She was sitting on a porch step in the sun, laughing at something, and on her lap was a little boy. The little boy had dark hair and serious eyes and was clutching a wooden carved horse. He looked about 5 years old. Standing behind them with one large hand resting gently on the boy's head was the weathered man from the other photograph. His grandfather, Ezra. He was looking down at the boy with an expression Silas had never seen directed at him in his life. Not from anyone. He flipped the picture over with shaking fingers. The handwriting on the back was the same precise hand from the map. The day I had to let him go. I will be waiting. Silas felt something break open in his chest. He read it again, and again, and again. The day I had to let him go. He had always been told in the careful language of social workers that after his mother died, no relatives had come forward. No one had wanted him. That was the story. That was the reason the system had kept him for 12 years. That was the reason he had spent every Christmas eating turkey from a foil tray at a long table with 30 other children who also had no one. But the photograph said something else. The photograph said his grandfather had held him, had stood behind him with a hand on his head, had looked at him like he was a thing to be loved. And then, for some reason, Silas did not yet understand, had let him go. I will be waiting. The bus climbed. The flat fields gave way to rolling hills and then to the jagged foothills of a mountain range Silas had only ever seen in pictures. The trees grew taller, denser. The sky seemed bigger, a deeper, colder blue. The bus engine whined as it pulled the long grade. They passed through small towns with single stoplights and peeling paint on their storefronts. People got on and off their faces, weathered their clothes practical. They looked at Silas in his thin city jacket with a kind of blank, non-judgmental curiosity. He was clearly not from around here. He was something other. He held the photograph the entire way. When the bus driver finally called out, "Silver Creek last stop," the sun was going down behind the western ridge, and Silas was the only passenger left. He stepped off the bus into a shock of cold, thin air that took his breath away. The town of Silver Creek was little more than a wide spot in the road, a general store with a single gas pump out front, a sleepy-looking diner with steamed-up windows, a post office, a handful of houses scattered up the hillside like dropped dice. A single stoplight blinked yellow in the gathering dusk, illuminating nothing. The bus pulled away with a sigh of air brakes. The red taillights disappeared around a bend, and Silas was alone in a silence so deep it seemed to ring. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the whisper of wind in the pines and the distant rush of water somewhere unseen. It smelled of pine needles and damp earth and the iron scent of coming snow. It was the sound of a world that did not care about sirens or deadlines or the clicking of deadbolts. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing. A man came out of the general store, locking the door behind him. He was old, well into his 70s, Silas guessed. His face was creased and folded like a crumpled map left out in the rain, but his eyes were sharp, and his hands as he turned the key in the lock were steady. He looked at Silas, at the cardboard box, at the thin jacket. "You look a little lost, son," the man said. "I am looking for the old access road," Silas said. His voice felt small in the vastness. Up toward the ridge, the old man went still. Then his eyes traveled slow and careful from Silas's face down to the manila envelope sticking out of the box, and back up. And something in his expression shifted, softened maybe, or sharpened. Silas could not tell which. "What is your name?" the old man asked. His voice had changed. It was quieter now. "Silas. Silas Thornquist." The old man closed his eyes for one long second. When he opened them, they were wet. "I am Hank," he said. "Hank Doyle. I knew your grandfather's son. I knew him a long time." He nodded once slowly, like he was confirming something to himself. "He told me 6 years ago that one day a boy might come walking into my store. He told me what name to listen for. He said when that boy came, I should help him." Silas felt the cold deepen around him. Why, he asked. Hank looked up the dark road toward the ridge where the pines climbed into night. "Because he said your grandfather knew he was running out of time, and he knew there was something on that mountain that needed someone to inherit it. He said you were the only one left who could." Silas could not speak. Hank turned and unlocked the store again. The bell above the door jingled. He waved Silas inside. "You are not walking up there tonight, son," he said. "Road's bad. Weather is turning. You sleep on the cot in my back room. You eat a hot meal. In the morning, I will drive you as far as the truck can go. And then, God help you, you walk the rest of the way." Silas stepped into the warmth of the store. It smelled of coffee and motor oil and old wood. He set his box down on the counter very carefully, as though it might break. That night, in the back room on a cot under a wool blanket, he held the photograph of his mother and his grandfather and the small boy in the sunlight. He stared at the ceiling. He listened to the wind moving through the pines outside. "I will be waiting." He did not sleep much. In the gray hour before dawn, Hank's old Ford pickup truck rattled up the dirt road as far as it could go, and then stopped where the road simply ended. A faint trail continued into the trees. Hank handed Silas a thermos of coffee, a wool hat that had clearly belonged to someone who was no longer alive to wear it, and a paper bag with 2 ham sandwiches. "You follow the creek," Hank said. "You keep the ridge to your right shoulder. 3 miles in, you will see the place. You cannot miss it." He paused. "And son, listen to me. There are people in this valley who do not want you to make it up there. You watch the trees. You watch the road behind you. You hear me." Silas nodded. He could not speak. Hank reached out. He put one large, weathered hand on Silas's shoulder, the same way the man in the photograph had once put his hand on a small boy's head. "Welcome home, son," Hank said. Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away. Silas walked. The trail wound up through old growth pine and fir, the air thinning with each step. His city sneakers slipped on damp pine needles. His shoulder burned from the weight of the box. The sun rose behind him, long shafts of gold cutting through the branches. He passed a small, clear stream ice forming at its edges and stopped to drink. The water was so cold it hurt his teeth and tasted like stone and snowmelt. It was the cleanest thing he had ever put in his mouth. He kept walking. The trail finally opened into a small, overgrown clearing, and what he saw there stopped him in his tracks. It was both more and less than he had imagined. A large, corrugated steel arch, a Quonset hut, was shoved up against a sheer granite cliff face. It was not just next to the rock. It was integrated into the rock, the back half of the metal structure, disappearing into a wide, dark opening, the mouth of a cave. The steel was rusted, a deep, angry orange streaked with black from years of rain and snow. The front was a patchwork of plywood and salvaged windows, one of which was shattered a jagged grin in the morning light. Weeds and small saplings grew right up to the walls, trying to reclaim the metal structure and pull it back down into the earth. It looked less like a building and more like a wreck, a scar on the landscape. This was it. Parcel 734-B, his inheritance, his home. A wave of something close to despair washed over him. Whitfield had been right. It was worthless. It was a ruin. He dropped the box and the sleeping bag in the wet grass and just stood there, listening to the drip of water from the eaves, the sigh of wind in the pines. He was an idiot. A romantic, stupid kid who had chosen a rusty key over $1,600 and a bus ticket to anywhere warm. He almost turned around, but he was tired, and the iron key was in his pocket. And somewhere inside that ruin was a story he had walked 300 miles to hear. He picked up the box. He walked across the clearing. The door was a solid slab of weathered oak, secured with a heavy-duty padlock that looked 100 years old. Silas pulled the iron key from his pocket. It felt ancient in his hand. He slid it into the lock. It was stiff, resistant. He had to lean his whole weight against it. And then, with a deep groan of protesting metal, something inside gave way with a loud, satisfying clunk. The lock fell open. He pulled the door inward. It scraped against the floor, and a wave of cold air rolled out to meet him, smelling of stone and rust and damp earth and something else. Something he could not name. The smell of a place that had been waiting. He stepped inside. The interior was one large, cavernous space. The curved metal walls amplified every sound. Light filtered in through dirty windows and the hole in the roof illuminating swirling motes of dust. The floor was concrete in the front and packed earth toward the back, where the hut transitioned seamlessly into the cave. The cave itself yawned away into a black void deeper than his flashlight beam could reach. Against one wall stood a cast-iron wood stove, rusted but solid. A neat stack of split firewood beside it, dry and ready, as though the man who had stacked it had only stepped out an hour ago. A crude wooden workbench ran along the other wall, and on it in perfect order sat the tools of someone who had worked with his hands every day. A heavy hammer, a set of wrenches laid out by size, a hand drill with a wooden handle, jars of screws and nails and washers, each one labeled in that same precise hand. A simple metal cot with a mattress that had long since given up was pushed against the far wall. And in the exact center of the floor, squat and immovable and impossible to ignore, was a heavy olive-drab metal footlocker, the kind from old war movies, sealed with a thick brass combination lock that looked military-grade. Silas stood in the doorway and felt the weight of 17 years settle around him. He walked deeper inside, his footsteps echoing in the strange half-building, half-cave. He passed the workbench. He let his hand drift across the tools. The cold, smooth wood of the hammer handle, the oil-darkened steel of the wrenches. They were not abandoned. They were waiting. He reached the back wall where the curved metal of the Quonset met the rough living stone of the cave, and he stopped. He felt the air change, cooler, older. He turned slowly, taking it all in, and his eye caught on something tacked above the workbench. A faded calendar, the kind a hardware store gives away at Christmas. It was years out of date, the picture above the dates showing a snowy mountain scene. But on the calendar itself, on the page for the current month, one date had been circled in heavy red pencil. The 28th, Silas's birthday, his 18th birthday. 3 weeks from today, his grandfather had been preparing, marking the day, counting forward, making ready. Whatever he had been planning, whatever had been in his mind in his last months alive, he had been pointing toward that single circle date in red. The day Silas became a man under the eyes of the law. The day he could legally inherit. The day Ezra Thornquist had been waiting for all along. And he had not made it. He had died 3 months ago. 6 weeks short, Silas stood in the silent hut looking at that small red circle, and he understood for the first time what the photograph had meant. I will be waiting. He had been waiting his whole life. He had stockpiled food. He had prepared a workshop. He had locked his secrets in a box made of war steel. He had gathered everything he had built into one place, and then he had run out of time. He had run. The boy he had been forced to let go was supposed to walk through that door 3 weeks from now, as an 18-year-old man, with nothing on his record, with nothing to lose. Instead, he had walked through it today, 3 weeks early. As a frightened kid clutching a cardboard box, Silas lowered himself slowly to the cold floor, his back against the footlocker. And for the first time since the door of Northgate had clicked shut behind him, he let himself cry. He cried for his mother in the yellow dress. He cried for the small boy in the photograph who had been let go. He cried for the old man who had built a shelter, stocked it with blankets and canned food, and circled a date in red, only to die before the door could open. He cried because it had not been abandonment. It had never been abandonment. It had been a long, lonely, patient act of love, stretched across 12 years and 200 miles, and he had not known. Nobody had told him. Nobody had let him know. When he stopped, the light through the broken window had shifted. It was afternoon. He stood up. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. He looked at the footlocker. He looked at the hammer on the workbench. He looked last at the iron key in his hand. He had 3 weeks. Whatever was inside this box, whatever his grandfather had locked away and waited a lifetime to give him, was gonna come out. Today. Tomorrow. Whatever it took. Silas Thornquist, 17 years old, 3 weeks shy of becoming a man, picked up the hammer. He walked toward the locker, and he began. The hammer was heavier than he remembered hammers being. Or maybe he was just tired. Maybe 17 years of being told he was nothing had finally settled into his arms, and now he had to lift it all at once just to swing. He brought it down on the brass lock. The sound that came back was not satisfying. It was a flat, dead clang that rang through the metal walls of the hut and died in the cave behind him. The lock did not crack. It did not even bend. A small, bright dent appeared in the brass, and that was all. He swung again and again, until his shoulders burned and his palms ached, and the hammer felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The lock held. It was made for war. It had been chosen, like everything else in this place, by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Silas dropped the hammer. He stood there, breathing hard, his breath fogging in the cold air. He looked around the hut. at the workbench, at the tools laid out in their precise rows, at the calendar with its red circle. His grandfather had not been a man who used force. His grandfather had been a man who used patience, who used precision, who used the right tool for the right job. Silas walked to the workbench. He let his eyes move slowly over the tools, the way Ezra must have moved his eyes 1,000 times, choosing what he needed: the wrenches, the screwdrivers, the small brass-handled file, and the hand drill. The old kind with a wooden handle and a brace that you turn by hand, the kind nobody made anymore. The kind that did not need electricity. He picked it up. In a small wooden case beside it, in a velvet-lined slot, was a set of drill bits. He chose the smallest one, a bit no thicker than a sewing needle. He carried the drill back to the footlocker. He laid the box on its side. He found the seam where the lid met the body, a hairline crack of darkness running along the front edge. He braced the tip of the bit against the lid just above that seam. He leaned his weight into it, and he began to turn the handle. The metal screeched. For a long time, nothing happened. He was just polishing the paint. His arm burned. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cold. He kept going. Turn and push. Turn and push. The frustration of every door that had ever closed in his face. Every social worker who had not looked up from her files every quiet Christmas at a long table with strangers. All of it went into the slow grinding turn of that handle. And then something changed. The bit caught. It bit into the steel with a sudden grinding shriek, and it punched through. A tiny hole, no bigger than a pinprick, but it was there. And it was a way in, Silas laughed. A short, surprised sound, the first laugh he could remember in months. He drilled another hole an inch from the first, then another, and another. He worked his way along the seam, the cold, forgotten, the day passing without his noticing. By the time he stopped, his hand cramped and his back screaming. He had a perforated line running the entire length of the front of the locker, like the dotted line on a coupon. He took the crowbar from the workbench. He wedged the tip into the first hole. He pulled. The metal groaned. It bent. And then, with a long tearing sound like fabric ripping the seam, began to open along the line he had drilled. He worked his way down, prying, pulling, until the entire front edge of the lid was a jagged, peeled-back mess of torn steel. He stopped. He sat back on his heels. He lifted the mangled lid. The smell rose up to meet him. Old paper, oilcloth, cedar. The particular scent of things that had been carefully sealed away by a careful man who meant for them to last. The contents were packed with military precision. On top, a neatly folded stack of heavy wool blankets, 3 of them smelling faintly of mothballs. Beneath the blankets, the survival cache, cans of beans and stew and chili and peaches and pears. Boxes and boxes stacked with the efficiency of a man who had done his arithmetic. A small camp stove with 2 fuel canisters, boxes of waterproof matches, a first aid kit military green sealed with tape, a water filter still in its package, a coil of strong cord, a box of candles. It was not a treasure hoard. It was a survival kit, enough to keep one person alive through one winter with care. He had known. Ezra had known someone would be coming. He had known they would arrive with nothing. Silas's hands began to shake as he lifted out the cans. Beneath the food wrapped in oilcloth were 2 more objects. The first was the hand crank generator, just like the lawyer had hinted at, a small, ingenious thing with a light bulb attached and ports for charging. A source of power, of light. The second was a thick leather-bound journal. The leather was dark and softened with age. the cover marked by the constant pressure of a thumb in one specific spot, where his grandfather had held it day after day for years. And on top of the journal, lying flat and white and waiting, was a single sealed envelope. On the front, in that same neat, precise handwriting from the map, and the photograph, was one word: Silas. He sank to the cold floor with the envelope in his hands. He sat there for a long time. He looked at his own name written in the hand of a dead man. He thought about how strange it was, how strange and how impossibly ordinary that across all the years and all the silence this man had known how to spell his name, had practiced it maybe, had written it in the margins of his journals, had carried it in his mouth like a prayer. With unsteady fingers he broke the seal. The paper inside was thick and creamy. The ink was a faded blue. The letter began. My dear Silas, if you are reading this, then it means I am gone, and you have found your way here. I am sorry. That is the first thing I must say. I am sorry for not being in your life. I am sorry for the silence. I hope in time you will understand that my absence was not a failure of love, but a desperate act of it. When your mother died, I wanted to take you in more than anything in this world. But I was already in trouble then, deep in something I had started years before, something that had cost me my career and my reputation, and would have in time cost me my life. To bring you into my house then would have been to put a target on your back. The system, for all its faults, was a place they could not reach you. It was the hardest choice I ever made. Not a single day has gone by that I have not regretted it, and not a single day that I have not been certain it was right. This land, this place, is not much, but it is everything I have to give you. It is a refuge, and it is a weapon. You will find what you need to survive in this box. But the real inheritance is not in the hut. It is deeper. It is in the rock itself. You have 90 days before the county takes the land. The wolves who want this place, the ones called Pioneer Development, will come at you with what looks like an open hand. It is not an open hand. They are the enemy. Do not sell. Do not trust them. Do not believe a word they tell you. Your task, should you choose it, is to find what I have hidden and to finish what I could not. It is a truth, and it is worth protecting. Start with the floor, the north wall, where the steel meets the stone. Be strong, my boy. You come from a line of stubborn people. It is in you. I have always known it was in you. Your grandfather, Ezra Thornquist. Silas read the letter 3 times. The words blurred and sharpened. The cold floor under him faded away. The whole world narrowed to a single sheet of paper and a single name signed at the bottom. A weapon. A truth. 90 days. He looked up. He looked around the hut. The rusted shell that had seemed an hour ago like a ruin. It did not look like a ruin anymore. It looked like a fortress. A long, quiet fortress built by one man alone, waiting for one boy to walk through the door. He folded the letter. He put it in his pocket against his chest, where he could feel it. Then he picked up the journal. He spent that night and the next 2 days reading. He read until his eyes burned. He read until the words swam, and he had to stop and press his palms against his face and breathe. He cooked beans on the camp stove and ate them straight from the can. He drank water from the small, clear stream out behind the hut, where the rocks were green with moss. He fed the wood stove and watched the cast iron glow a dull, comforting red in the gathering cold of evening. And he read. The journal began 20 years ago. The first entry was short, almost nothing. They think I am just a crazy old rockhound his grandfather had written. Let them. The truth is in the water. The water never lies." He turned the page. The second entry was a careful list of supplies. The third was a sketch of the cave from outside with measurements. The fourth was the beginning of his grandfather's real story told to no one but the page. Ezra Thornquist had been a geologist for a mining and minerals corporation. A real one. With a degree from Colorado School of Mines and a respectable career, and a wife buried in a churchyard outside Boulder, and a daughter, Sarah, who had grown up watching her father pack samples into wooden crates on Saturday mornings. In the late 1990s, Ezra had begun to notice things. The disposal records did not match the disposal volumes. The trucks went out heavier than the manifest said. They came back empty too fast, as though they had not gone where they claimed to go. Soil samples downstream of the company's holdings showed elevated levels of metals that should not have been there. Heavy metals, industrial solvents, things that did not belong in groundwater. He filed reports, internal at first, quietly, the way a man files a complaint when he still believes the system will work the way it is supposed to. The reports vanished into desks. He filed again, louder. He was called into a meeting. He was told in careful words that he was a valued employee who was perhaps overworked. He was told he should take some time off. He was told his career had a long, bright future ahead of it if he was the kind of man who knew when to look away. He was not that kind of man, so they took the future from him. They fired him on a thin pretext. They put him on a list, the kind of list that does not exist on paper. And after that, no mining company in the western United States would hire him. He was 60 years old. His wife was already dead. His daughter, Sarah, had a small son, a boy named Silas, and a husband who was not built for the long haul. An Ezra Thornquist geologist, 29 years in the field, was suddenly completely finished. Silas read this in the cabin, and he could not move. He read about how his grandfather had spent 2 years just trying to survive, doing odd jobs, cataloging rock samples for a small museum, watching his savings drain. And then, when it would have been easy to surrender, when any reasonable man would have lain down and quit, Ezra had done something else. He had bought 5.2 acres of worthless rock in Telluride County, because his old maps, the ones he had drawn himself in the field, told him that this exact spot sat directly above the main artery of the aquifer his old company had been poisoning. And every other access point along that aquifer had already been bought up by his old company's new owner. A new corporation with a new name. Pioneer Development. They had absorbed the old company. They had buried its records. They had reorganized its waste sites and rebranded them as future resort properties. They had erased the past the way men in suits know how to erase the past. But they had missed 5.2 acres of rock and trees. And on those 5 acres, Ezra Thornquist had built a metal hut against a cave, and he had begun alone and unpaid and unrecognized to keep score. The journals were the score. For 20 years, he had taken samples. Once a week, sometimes once a day. He had labeled them. He had sent them at his own expense to independent laboratories all across the country. Different labs each time so that no one could buy them all. 12 labs, 15, 20 over the years. Each one running the same tests. Each one returning the same results. Hexavalent chromium, arsenic, perchlorate, at levels that exceeded federal safety standards by factors of 10, by factors of 50, by factors that made Silas, sitting on a cold floor with a flashlight in his hand, feel a slow, nauseous chill move up his spine. It was not a leak. It was not an accident. It was not a one-time mistake. It was 20 years of poison flowing slowly downhill through the aquifer into the wells of every farm and ranch and small town between this ridge and the next valley. It was the water people drank, the water they cooked with, the water they bathed their children in. And on the second day, deep in one of the journals, Silas found his grandfather's careful cross-reference. Ezra had not stopped at the water samples. He had pulled public health records, county by county, year by year. He had charted the rates of certain cancers, the rates of certain birth defects, the rates of certain rare illnesses that should not have been clustered in a region this small. And the charts, when he laid them next to the contamination plume on his hand-drawn map, lined up like a key sliding into a lock. People were dying. People had been dying slowly for 2 decades while a corporation built brochures about a future ski resort. Silas closed the journal. He set it on his knee. He looked up at the dark mouth of the cave at the back of the hut, and he understood for the first time fully what his grandfather had meant. It is a weapon. He understood also why a man would spend 20 years alone in a metal hut. Why a man would let his only grandson grow up in a group home rather than under his roof. Why a man would circle a date in red on a calendar and stockpile blankets and canned food and a hand-crank generator, and wait for that grandson to be old enough, legal enough, free enough to take up the work. Ezra Thornquist had not been hiding from his family. He had been hiding his family from the people who would have hurt them if they had known he had family at all. That night, Silas slept on the cot for the first time. He pulled 3 of the wool blankets over himself and he listened to the wind move around the metal hut. And he did not feel afraid. He felt something he had no name for yet. He felt watched over. In the morning, he went to the floor, the north wall, where the steel meets the stone. That was what the letter had said. He carried the flashlight back to the place where the curved metal of the Quonset bolted into the bare rock of the cave entrance. The concrete slab of the front room ended about 10 feet short of the back wall, giving way to packed brown earth hard as stone underfoot. He swept the floor clean with a branch broom he had found leaning against the workbench. He knelt. He ran his hands over the dirt. It was strange dirt, too uniform, too hard, almost like cement. He went back to the journal and he found the schematic. It was a hand-drawn diagram of the hut itself, with all the dimensions, all the bolt placements, all the angles measured to the millimeter. And in the corner beside the drawing of the back wall, his grandfather had written one small notation: 1.2 meters, not from the side, from the edge of the concrete, inward. Silas found a tape measure on the workbench. The metal tape was rusted, but the numbers were still legible. He hooked it to the edge of the slab and measured 1.2 meters out. He marked the spot with the point of a nail. He knelt. He took the back of the hammer and he tapped the ground. Thud, 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 the sound went 4 times. And then on the 5th tap in the spot he had marked, the sound changed. Not thud. Hollow. His heart kicked once hard against his ribs. He went back to the workbench. He chose the spade. The tip of the spade scraped uselessly across the surface, and he understood why the floor felt like cement. It was cement. A thin layer of cement dyed brown and mixed with dirt poured carefully over whatever lay beneath. Camouflage. A man who built a hut to look like a wreck would build a floor to look like dirt. He switched to the crowbar. He drove it into the marked spot with the back of the hammer. Chipping. Prying. Slow, brutal work that took him most of the morning. The crust came up in chunks. And underneath, dark and dry and impossibly intact, was wood. A subfloor. Heavy planks treated with creosote. Fitted tight together. He pried up the first plank. Old nails screamed and let go. The plank came away in his hands. He shone his flashlight into the opening and he saw a shallow crawl space, perhaps 2 feet deep, dry and dust-smelling, lined with what looked like cedar. It was full of boxes, not footlockers, archival boxes, acid-free, neatly labeled. The kind of box a museum would use, each one marked in his grandfather's hand with a date range and a code. Silas pulled up another plank, then another, until the entire crawl space was open, and the cold, dry air of it rose up around him. There were dozens of boxes, maybe 50. He lifted the first one out. He set it on the floor of the hut. He opened the lid. It was full of files, not just lab reports. He had seen the lab reports already. This was something different. This was the original samples, the chain of custody documents, the notarized affidavits from each lab certifying the contents of the bottles and the dates of the tests and the credentials of the chemists who had performed them. Stacks and stacks of legally bulletproof documentation, the kind of paperwork no corporate lawyer could wave away in a hearing. And tacked to the inside of the lid was a map, a larger version of the topographical map he had been carrying in his pocket. But this one was overlaid with information. Each red dot was a sample site. Each blue dot was a confirmed contamination reading. Each green dot was a public health cluster. And the dots together made a shape, a plume, a long teardrop of color spreading downhill from a single point, a single concentrated source of contamination in the foothills above Silver Creek, a point that sat squarely on land owned by Pioneer Development. Silas sat on the floor and looked at the map and thought for the first time in his life. The words, "I am holding something that can change things." It was almost too big to look at directly. He understood now why his grandfather had stayed up here, why a man who had once had a wife and a daughter and a house in Boulder had lived 20 years on a cot under a leaking roof. Pioneer Development had been buying up every acre of accessible land along this aquifer for a decade, methodically, patiently, the way a man covers his tracks. Every parcel except this one, because Ezra Thornquist had refused year after year every offer they had made him. He had refused because if this land changed hands, the only independent monitoring point would be lost. And without it, 20 years of evidence became a story without a witness. He had been the witness. He had been the only witness. And now, by the simple legal accident of blood, he had passed the witness stand to a 17-year-old boy in borrowed boots. Silas closed the lid of the box. He carried it to the workbench. He set it down beside the others he was now lining up one by one, lifting them out of the floor like a man unearthing his own family history. By the time the light through the broken window had turned afternoon gold, he had 30 boxes stacked neatly along the wall of the hut. By the time it turned evening orange, he had 40. He stood in the middle of his grandfather's life and looked at it. Then he washed his hands in cold water. He boiled coffee on the camp stove. He sat on the cot with his back against the curved metal wall of the hut. And he began the slow, patient work of becoming the man who could carry this. He read. He read the affidavits. He read the chain of custody forms. He read the public health overlays. He learned in fits and starts to read the chemistry well enough, at least to understand what the numbers meant. He did not understand all of it. He did not have to. The pattern was so clear that even a boy with a high school education and a peanut butter sandwich could see it. Pioneer Development had been poisoning the water of an entire valley for 20 years. His grandfather had spent 20 years proving it, and now 90 days was running out. He kept up the work of the hut. He chopped wood with the splitting maul behind the cabin until his hands blistered and the blisters broke and the broken places hardened into something else. He carried water from the stream in 2 5-gallon jugs, balanced across his shoulders on a broom handle, the way he had seen pictures of old farmers do. He patched the broken window with plywood and a tarp. He cleaned the wood stove. He swept the floor. He took samples himself every morning, the way the journal had taught him, in clean jars labeled with the date and the time and the location, and he stored them in a shaded pit beneath a corner of the hut where the temperature stayed cool. He was building the next chain, the chain after his grandfather's chain. He had no idea yet what he would do with it. He only knew that he would not be the one to break it. On the 10th day, he went to Silver Creek for supplies. He walked the 8 miles down to Hank's store before sunrise, and he bought rice and oatmeal and dried beans and powdered milk and 2 boxes of Strike Anywhere, matches, and a bar of soap. Hank rang him up without speaking much, but his eyes followed Silas the whole time, careful and measuring. When Silas put his money on the counter, Hank pushed 2 of the bills back. "You take that, son," Hank said. "Call it a discount. Call it what you want." Silas did not argue. He nodded. He shouldered the pack. He started for the door. Hank stopped him. "Be careful out there, son," he said. "Pioneer's been asking around, asking who came in on the bus that night, asking about the kid with the box." Silas felt the cold come back into his chest, but he nodded. He stepped out into the morning sun. He walked the 8 miles back. He kept his eyes on the trees the way Hank had told him. He did not see them yet, but he felt them. 2 days later, they came. It was mid-morning. He was at the workbench transferring the day's samples into a new wooden case when he heard the sound he had been listening for without knowing it. A truck engine. Up the dirt road, where no truck should have been able to come because the road did not go all the way through. Someone had walked in. Someone had come on foot from the federal forest side. Silas set down the sample bottle. He moved quietly to the broken window. He looked out through the patch of clear glass. 2 men were crossing the clearing. The one in front was tall, well-dressed for the wilderness in a clean canvas jacket and good boots. He had a face that smiled with the lower half and not the upper. The man behind him was shorter, weather-hardened, with the easy alertness of a man who hunted for a living. A rifle was slung across his back, casual the way a farmer carries a tool he uses every day. The tall man stopped about 20 feet from the door. He raised his hand in a slow, friendly wave. "Silas," he called. His voice was warm, calm, used to being heard. "I know you are in there. My name is Ellis Crow. I represent Pioneer Development. I would very much like a word with you, son. I have brought coffee." He held up a thermos. "If you let me in," Ellis Crow said, "I think we can save each other a great deal of trouble." Silas's hand closed around the handle of the hammer on the workbench. Outside in the bright, cold morning, Ellis Crow smiled with the lower half of his face and waited for the door to open. Silas opened the door. He did not open it wide. He cracked it just enough to be seen, just enough to see. And he kept the hammer down by his thigh where the men outside could not see it, but where his hand would not forget it was there. The cold morning air pushed in around him, smelling of pine and wood smoke, and something else now. Aftershave. Expensive. The kind of smell that did not belong on a mountain. Ellis Crow took 1 step closer. He did not push for the door. He was too smart for that. He stopped at a respectful distance in the soft brown grass at the edge of the clearing, and he lowered the thermos slowly to his side. The way a man lowers a hand when he is dealing with a dog whose temperament he does not yet know. "You must be tired, son," Crow said. His voice was warm and easy, the voice of a man who sold things for a living and was good at it. "You have had a long couple of weeks. Bus rides, cold nights, all this rust and dust. Your grandfather lived hard up here. Hardest man I ever met in his way. I am sorry for your loss." Silas said nothing. The hunter behind Crow did not move. He stood in the grass with his thumbs hooked into his belt, the rifle a casual line across his back, his eyes traveling the length of the cabin, the cliff, the dark mouth of the cave. Reading the place, memorizing it. "May I come in?" Crow said. "Just for a few minutes. There is a great deal we should talk about. And I would very much rather do it indoors, with that thermos between us, than out here on the grass." Silas swallowed. His throat was dry. He stepped back from the door. He did not say yes. He simply opened it, and Ellis Crow took that for the answer he wanted. And he walked across the clearing with the unhurried step of a man who had been invited into 1,000 kitchens and offices, and made himself at home in every one. The hunter did not follow. He stayed in the grass, settling onto his heels, lighting a cigarette, watching the trees, watching the door. Crow stepped inside. He paused just over the threshold and let his eyes adjust. He looked around the hut the way a man looks around a museum he had heard about and did not quite believe was real. The cast iron stove, the workbench with its tools laid in their precise rows, the cot in the corner, the boxes lined up along the wall. The boxes. Crow's eyes lingered on the boxes for 1 second too long. Then he turned smiling and offered the thermos. Silas did not take it. He set the hammer down on the workbench slowly, and he did not let go of it until his hand was empty. Crow noticed. He pretended not to. "May I sit?" he said. Silas nodded toward the cot. He himself stayed standing near the workbench, near the door, near the hammer. Crow sat. He set the thermos down on the floor beside his good boots. He folded his gloved hands in his lap. He looked for a long moment at the boy across from him, and his face did something complicated, something almost regretful. The face of a man who genuinely wished things were simpler. "Silas," he said. "May I call you Silas?" "That is my name." Crow nodded. "Silas, I want you to understand something. I am not your enemy. I know that is what you have been told. I know that is what the journals in those boxes will tell you, if you read them. Your grandfather was a brilliant man, truly. One of the most brilliant geologists this state has ever produced. But he was also, by the end, a haunted one. He believed things. He chased things. He spent 20 years up here on a cold mountain because he could not let go of an idea that had broken something in him a long time ago. I am not here to tell you he was wrong about everything. He was not. But he was wrong about a great deal. And what he was wrong about, he did not let go of. And what he did not let go of became his life." Silas said nothing. "He let me see his journals once," Crow said. "Did you know that? 8 years ago. He invited me up here. He showed me the maps, the samples, the public health overlays. He thought he was going to convert me. He thought a man like me sitting where you are sitting now would look at his work and confess. He thought I would weep." The corners of Crow's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. I did not weep. I asked him questions. I asked him about his methodology. I asked him about lab variability. I asked him about the difference between correlation and causation. I asked him about the fact that hexavalent chromium occurs naturally in many Western aquifers, and that any single sample, no matter how alarming, does not prove a source. He paused. He could not answer me, Crow said. Not really. And so we sat across from each other, your grandfather and I, on this very cot perhaps, and we both knew that what he had was not enough. He knew it. I knew it. and I went home, and your grandfather, God rest him, went back to work for another 8 years. Crow leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice softened. Silas, I'm going to tell you something hard. Your grandfather was a good man who believed a true thing in a way that could never be proven. That is a tragedy. It is not a crime. It does not make my company a villain. We have been buying up that valley for 20 years because we are building a resort. A real one. 500 jobs. Tax revenue that will rebuild every road and every school in this county. The people downstream of you, the ones your grandfather wanted to save, they want the work, son. They want the school lunches funded. They want the clinic open on Saturdays. They do not want a 17-year-old boy in a cabin telling them what to drink. Silas felt something tighten low in his chest. The words were doing what they were designed to do. They were finding the cracks. They were sliding in. He looked at the boxes against the wall. He looked at the calendar above the workbench with the red circle on the date that was now only a few days away. He thought about a hand on a small boy's head in a photograph. "What do you want?" he said. Crow smiled, a real smile this time. He reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. He took out a single white envelope. He set it on the cot beside him, where Silas could see it but not reach it. "I want to make you an offer," Crow said. "The one Whitfield gave you was the standard. $30,000. Pays the taxes. Buys you a fresh start." That offer was real. It still stands. But here's the thing, son. I am authorized today, sitting on this cot, to do better than that. He tapped the envelope. $75,000. Cash. Today. Wired to any account you name or handed to you in this room in $50 bills, your choice. Pays the taxes. Leaves you with nearly $50,000 free and clear. That is more money than your grandfather ever made in a year of his life, Silas. That is a college tuition. That is a down payment on a small house in a town with a movie theater and a girl your age behind the counter at the diner. That is a future. He paused. He let the number sit. In return, Crow said, you sign a single piece of paper. You transfer the deed. You agree not to discuss the contents of this property with any media outlet, regulatory agency, or third party. We do the rest. We pay the back taxes. We clear the lien. We take possession of this hut and the cave behind it. And what is in those boxes goes into a vault in Denver, where it stops being a problem for you and stops being a problem for the people of this valley. He smiled the lower half of his face again. We even put a small marker out in the clearing, he said, with your grandfather's name on it. He earned that much. Silas looked at the envelope on the cot. He thought about a movie theater. He thought about a girl behind a diner counter. He thought about waking up in a bed in a real house with heat that came through vents in the wall with no leak in the roof, and no 8-mile walk to a grocery store, and no two men with rifles standing in his clearing. He thought for one long, honest second about saying yes. And then he looked again at the boxes against the wall. 40 of them now. Each one a year of a man's life. Each one a stack of laboratory affidavits and notarized chains of custody and public health charts that lined up like a key sliding into a lock. Each one a piece of a witness who had stood alone for 20 years on a cold mountain because no one else would. He thought about the line on the back of the photograph. The day I had to let him go. I will be waiting. He thought about 3 weeks shy of 18. He thought about the people downstream, children with bone marrow disease, old men with kidneys that had failed too young, wives who buried husbands and could not name the thing that had killed them. He looked up at Ellis Crow. No, he said. Crow's face did not move. Not at first. The smile stayed where it had been left. Then very slowly, like a curtain coming down on an empty stage, the smile faded. "Son," he said, his voice still soft. "You should think about that for more than 1 second. I have been thinking about it my whole life," Silas said. He was surprised to find that his voice did not shake. "I just did not know it until this week. The answer is no. I am not selling. Not for 30,000. Not for 75,000. Not for any number you bring up that road." Crow sighed. He leaned forward. He put his elbows on his knees. He clasped his gloved hands together and he looked at the floor between his boots for a long moment. And when he looked back up, the warmth was gone from his face. What was left was not anger. It was something colder. It was the face of a man who had given the speech he was paid to give and was now moving on to the speech he was paid not to give. "Silas," he said, "listen to me very carefully. This is a hard country. Mountains, bad weather, wild animals, old wiring in old buildings, men who hunt up here in seasons that do not match the regulations. Accidents happen, son. They happen to old men who live alone, and they happen to young men who live alone. Your grandfather was a careful man, a very careful man. And one morning, a few months ago, he slipped on a patch of ice on the trail down to that creek out there. And he hit his head on a rock. And by the time anyone found him, the cold had finished what the fall started. That was an accident. That is what the report says. That is what we all believe." He stood up. He picked up the thermos. "I would hate," he said, "to have to read a similar report about you." He walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold and turned the morning light, catching the gray at his temples. And his face was not unkind. It was simply done. "Mountains are dangerous places for young men alone," Crow said. "Think about my offer, Silas. The number expires at sundown tomorrow. After that, things become much harder for everyone." He stepped out. He crossed the clearing to where the hunter was waiting. The two of them spoke for a moment low, and then they walked together back into the trees, the hunter pausing once to glance over his shoulder at the cabin, his face unreadable. They disappeared into the pines. Silas stood very still in the doorway. He did not move for a long time. The cold morning poured in past him. The fire in the wood stove popped once, and he flinched at the sound. And that was when he realized his entire body was shaking. Not from cold, from the long-held breath he had been holding, from the slow chemical wash of fear leaving a body that had been still as a deer in tall grass. He closed the door. He set the heavy plank across it that his grandfather had cut and shaped for exactly this. The plank dropped into its iron brackets with a sound like a verdict. He sat down on the floor with his back against the door, and he put his face in his hands, and he did not cry. He simply waited for his hands to stop shaking. It took a long time. When he could move again, he stood. He walked to the workbench. He picked up the journal that had been on top of all the others, the most recent one, the one with the worn cover where his grandfather's thumb had pressed for years. He opened it to the last page Ezra had written. The last entry was dated 4 days before the man had died. Crow came up again today, his grandfather had written. 3rd visit this winter. He is getting impatient. He stood in this room and looked at the floor, and I thought for a moment he could see through it. He cannot. He suspects. He does not know. I have been very careful, but he is getting close, and I am getting old, and I am beginning to think the boy will have to walk through that door before he is ready. God forgive me. There was no other way. Silas closed the journal. He held it against his chest for a moment, and then he set it down very gently, the way a man sets down a sleeping child. He slept that night with the hammer beside the cot. He did not sleep well. The wind moved around the metal hut, and every creak of the steel was a footstep. Every settle of the wood was a hand on a doorknob. Twice he sat up in the dark, certain he had heard something, and twice he lay back down and counted his breaths until his heart slowed. Sometime after midnight, the smell of smoke woke him. It was not wood stove smoke. The stove had burned down hours ago. This was harsher, closer. The smell of dry wood catching too fast. He was up and across the hut and at the window before he had decided to move. He pulled the corner of the tarp aside. The woodpile was burning. The neat stack of split firewood his grandfather had cut and stacked behind the cabin dry and ready. The winter's heat for one careful man was a wall of orange flame against the dark. The fire was climbing. The heat of it pushed against the cliff face and rolled back. Sparks lifted into the cold air and floated upward in a long, lazy spiral. Silas's first thought was that the cabin would catch. His second thought was that this was the point. He grabbed the bucket. He grabbed the second bucket. He pulled on his boots without lacing them, and he ran out into the freezing night. And for the next hour he carried water from the creek up the long slope to the cabin, and he threw it not on the fire which was beyond him, but on the cabin wall, and on the eaves and on the roof where the sparks were already trying to find a place to settle. His hands went numb. Water sloshed onto his pants and froze there. He fell once hard on a stone, and his knee opened up against the rock and bled into his trousers, and he kept carrying water. When the sun came up gray and reluctant over the eastern ridge, the cabin was still standing. The woodpile was a black smoking pit. The handcart he had been using to bring supplies up from where Hank dropped them was overturned in the grass, and both of its tires had been slashed neat deliberate with a sharp knife. There were boot prints in the soft earth around the cart. 2 pairs. Silas stood in the gray dawn and looked at all of it. He was no longer shaking. Something else had taken the place of fear. He did not have a word for it yet. It was older than fear and quieter than anger, and it sat low in his chest like a stone that had been waiting a long time to be picked up. He went inside. He washed the blood and the soot from his hands. He boiled water on the camp stove. He drank coffee black and bitter from a tin cup, and he opened his grandfather's journal, and he read the last entry one more time. The boy will have to walk through that door before he is ready. He closed the journal. He put on his coat and his hat and the boots Hank had given him, and he started walking. The 8 miles down to Silver Creek were the longest of his life. His knee throbbed. His shoulders ached from the buckets. His hands were raw. He passed the stream where his grandfather had supposedly slipped on a patch of ice, and he stopped beside it for a long moment, and he looked at the rocks at the edge of the water, and he understood the way you understand a sentence in a language you only half speak, that his grandfather had not slipped on anything. He kept walking. The bell over Hank's door jingled when he stepped inside, and Hank looked up from the counter, and his face did the thing it had done that first night. It went still. Then it changed. "You look like hell, son," Hank said softly. "They burned my woodpile," Silas said. He sat down on the wooden stool in front of the counter because he was suddenly not sure his legs would hold him. "They cut my cart. Crow came up yesterday. He offered me $75,000, and then he told me my grandfather slipped on a rock." Hank closed his eyes. He stood there for a long moment with his eyes closed, his weathered hands flat on the counter, and Silas watched something old and grieved and angry move across his face, and then settle there. When Hank opened his eyes, he reached under the counter. He pulled out a wooden cigar box, the kind that had once held 5-cent cigars, and now held by the look of it a small lifetime. He set it on the counter between them. He opened it. Inside were a few yellowed letters, a faded photograph of a younger Hank standing beside a younger Ezra. Both men holding fishing rods, both men laughing. A small brass key on a leather cord, and a thick white envelope sealed with a piece of tape that had darkened with age. The envelope had Silas's name on the front. 6 years ago, Hank said your grandfather walked into this store. He sat down on the stool you are sitting on right now, and he asked me to do something for him. He said one day a boy might walk through my door and that boy might say his name was Silas Thornquist. And that boy might come in tired and bleeding and asking for help. He said when that day came I should give him this. Hank pushed the envelope across the counter. He said Hank told me that if he had done his job right, I would be giving you this on a hard day, and the hardest day would mean you had earned it. Silas's hand shook as he picked up the envelope. I have been carrying that for 6 years, son, Hank said. There were days I thought maybe he had been wrong about you. Maybe you would never come. Maybe the system would swallow you, and there would be no one left to give it to. I am very glad I was wrong. Silas opened the envelope. Inside were 3 things. The first was a small brass key, identical to the one on the leather cord in the cigar box. A safe deposit box key with a number engraved on the bow. The number was 87. Below that, a name, First National Bank of Telluride. The second was a single sheet of paper in his grandfather's hand. Silas, the note began. If Hank has given you this, then they have come for you and the timeline has moved. I am sorry. Listen carefully. Box 87 at the bank in Telluride contains the only complete notarized set of every laboratory affidavit, every chain of custody document, and every public health overlay I have produced in 20 years. I made the originals. I deposited them when each one was new with a notary present, with the bank's seal applied to a ledger entry. They are sealed and witnessed and untouchable. The boxes in the cabin floor are duplicates. The originals are in town. That is the first weapon. The third object in the envelope was a folded sheet of paper. A list. Names, phone numbers, addresses, 3 reporters, 1 investigative journalist at a Denver paper, 1 environmental beat writer from a national magazine, 1 independent producer who made documentaries. And below the journalists, 2 names from the Environmental Protection Agency, one with a star drawn next to it, and the words, "She will believe you," in his grandfather's hand. Below them, 1 more name. A federal prosecutor in Denver, specializes in environmental crimes, has refused pioneer money twice, will not be bought. These people have been waiting. His grandfather had written, some of them know me. Some of them know my work. None of them have everything you now have. When the time comes, you will not need to convince the world from scratch. You will only need to walk into the right office with the right box, and the rest will move on its own. That is the second weapon. The third weapon, son, is not in this envelope. The third weapon is you. They have spent 20 years preparing for an old man with a grudge. They have not prepared for a boy with nothing left to lose, and the truth on his side. Do not make this a secret. Do not try to fight them in the dark. Walk into the daylight. Take Hank with you. Take Whitfield if he will come, and I think he will. And if he will not find another lawyer. There are good ones. Use the names on the list. Trust them in that order. Be brave. You come from stubborn people. Your grandfather, Ezra. Silas folded the paper slowly. He put it back in the envelope. He held the envelope in both hands. and he looked at Hank across the counter, and his eyes were very bright, but his face was very still. "Hank," he said, his voice low and steady, "I need to use your phone." Hank did not answer in words. He simply lifted the heavy black rotary handset from the back wall and set it on the counter between them. And he stood back, and he folded his arms across his chest, and he watched the boy that his old friend had spent 6 years waiting for finally pick up the receiver and dial. Silas dialed the number on Whitfield's business card. The secretary answered. He gave his name. He waited. He could hear in the background of the line the faint hum of a city far away, the clatter of a typewriter, a door opening. Then Whitfield came on the line. His voice clipped, irritated. The voice of a man interrupted. "Silas," he said, "have you come to your senses?" "I have," Silas said. "Then I am very glad. The Pioneer offer expires tomorrow at sundown, and frankly that is generous given the trouble you have caused. I will draw up the transfer papers this afternoon. You can sign them in my office Friday morning. I will have a check ready." "I am not selling," Silas said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice gone very, very quiet, Whitfield said, "Then why are you calling me Silas?" Silas took a breath. He looked at the cigar box, at the photograph of 2 young men with fishing rods, at Hank, who was watching him the way a man watches his own son grow up in a single afternoon. "I'm calling," Silas said, "because my grandfather kept boxes of laboratory affidavits hidden under the floor of his cabin for 20 years. And because Pioneer Development burned my woodpile last night. And because Ellis Crow walked into my home yesterday and told me my grandfather slipped on a rock, and they would hate to read a similar report about me, and because there is a safe deposit box in Telluride with the originals and a list of reporters and EPA agents and a federal prosecutor who has refused Pioneer money twice." He paused. He let it land. "I have everything Silas said. Every sample, every chain of custody, every public health overlay. 20 years of it, notarized, witnessed, sealed in a bank vault. And I would like to know, Mr. Whitfield, whether you are the kind of lawyer who looks at something like that and tells the boy to take the $1,600, or whether you are the other kind." There was a very long silence on the line. Silas could hear in that silence a man rearranging his entire morning, his entire week, possibly his entire idea of himself. Somewhere on the 32nd floor of a glass tower in Denver, Marcus Whitfield was sitting very still in a leather chair, and a calculation that had been running in the background of his life for many years was finally resolving. When Whitfield spoke, his voice had changed. It was not warm. Whitfield was not a warm man, but it was alive in a way it had not been before. "Where are you right now, Silas?" "A general store in Silver Creek." "Are you safe?" "For now." "Stay there. Do not go back up to that cabin alone today. Do you understand me?" "I understand. I am leaving Denver in 20 minutes. I will be in Silver Creek by tonight. Do not speak to anyone from Pioneer. Do not answer any door. Do not sign anything. If they call you, do not pick up. If they come to the store, you go in the back and Hank handles it. Tell me you understand." "I understand, Silas." The lawyer's voice was lower now, almost private. "I knew your grandfather. I represented him in a small matter 20 years ago, and I sent him away, and I have wondered more than I would like to admit whether I should have sent him somewhere else. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I think I do." "I'm driving up tonight," Whitfield said. I will see you in a few hours. Stay where you are, son." He hung up. Silas slowly put the receiver back in its cradle. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the black plastic, listening to the small, busy silence of the store. The tick of the wall clock above the door. The soft hum of the cooler in the corner. Outside, a truck went by and faded into the morning. The bell over the door did not ring. The day kept moving the way days do. Hank stepped forward. He put one large, weathered hand on Silas's shoulder. The same shoulder. The same hand. The same gesture that another old man had once made on a porch in the sunlight, in a photograph that had been hidden in a paperback for 12 years. He squeezed once. Then he let go. "We will get through today, son," Hank said quietly. "And tomorrow. And the day after. And one of these mornings you will wake up in that cabin and the war will be over. And you will get to find out who you are when nobody is shooting at you." Silas nodded. He could not speak. He looked through the front window of the store out at the empty road that wound up into the pines, up toward a metal cabin pressed against a cliff face, up toward a calendar with a circled date, up toward the lonely 20-year work of a man he had only met once, when he was 5 years old. The day his grandfather had let him go. He thought very clearly the way a boy thinks one true sentence in a life that has not given him many of them. "I am not letting go." He turned away from the window. He walked to the back of the store with Hank, where there was a back room with a cot and a wool blanket and a window that looked out onto a small wooded yard, and he sat down to wait for the lawyer to come up the long road from Denver, with the safe deposit key in one pocket and the names of 3 reporters and 1 prosecutor in the other, and his grandfather's last letter folded against his chest, where his heart was beating very steady and very slow, like the heart of a man. Outside, far up the mountain, the morning sun reached the metal roof of the Quonset hut and made it shine briefly like something built to last.